Chronicon Mundi.
Dive deep into history.
Welcome to this new chapter in our analysis of radical Islamism and jihadism.
And welcome to you, the listener. Today we're really undertaking what is arguably the most crucial step in understanding the phenomenon of global jihad.
It really is. I mean, to comprehend the strategies, the sheer ambition of the groups we see in the headlines today, you have to go back.
You have to trace their intellectual ancestry.
Absolutely. And the sources we've synthesized for this deep dive, they lay out a really comprehensive typology. They argue that global jihad isn't, a monolith.
No, not at all. It's a succession, a series of waves.
Exactly. 4 distinct iterations, or waves. And each one is defined by a specific crisis, a dominant figure, and a strategic pivot. Today, our mission is to examine the very genesis of this entire global movement.
We're going right back to the beginning.
We are. We're diving deep into the first wave of global jihad, which was launched, quite definitively, by the specific geopolitical crisis of the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, starting December 1979.
But before we even get to the tanks rolling in, we have to establish the ideological terrain. I mean, the concept of jihad itself has gone through centuries of reinterpretation.
Yeah, for the general listener, that word is just so loaded.
It is. But fundamentally, in classical Arabic, jihad just means effort or struggle in pursuit of a cause. It's quite a broad concept initially.
But it didn't stay abstract. That's the crucial pivot point, isn't it? The shift from, an internal spiritual effort to something much more political and military.
Exactly. By the 8th century, the early Muslim community is expanding, and the ulemas, the body of Islamic legal scholars, they begin to formalize the terminology.
So they narrow it down.
They narrowed it down heavily toward armed struggle, what's known in Arabic as al-qital. And this armed struggle was understood primarily as the means for the defense and, when necessary, the expansion of Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam.
So this effort becomes tied to fighting, especially when the community or its territory is under threat. But how do modern radicals, the Salafi jihadis, see it? Because they seem to elevate it way beyond just, a necessity.
They absolutely do. In the contemporary Salafi jihadi worldview, this physical struggle in the cause of God, it isn't just a necessary evil. It's not just a political obligation.
It's something more.
It is the absolute pinnacle of Islam. They call it its zenith, its apex. And crucially, they view it as an act of worship, an ibadah.
An act of worship, like prayer or fasting.
In the same class. By elevating fighting to that status, it becomes the ultimate vehicle by which the religion itself is defended and its supremacy is asserted. This theological jump is fundamental to every wave we're going to analyze. It's what turns a political fight into religious salvation for the person fighting.
Okay, let's unpack that transformation, because taking a duty that was traditionally episodic and making it the absolute pinnacle of worship, that requires a major intellectual leap.
It does.
And that brings us directly to one of the most foundational figures of modern Sunni jihadism, Sayyid Qutb.
Indeed. Qutb, an Egyptian intellectual, part of the Muslim Brotherhood, executed in 1966. He fundamentally altered the entire conceptual landscape.
So how did he do it?
Well, historically, as we said, armed jihad, jihad al-Sayf, was episodic. It was a formal, structured event. It was declared by the supreme authority, the caliph, in response to a tangible event, like an invasion.
Right. It had a clear beginning and a clear end.
A beginning and an end. When the conflict was over, the mujahideen would return home. The obligation was fulfilled.
But Qutb looked at the modern world and said, that's not enough. He wanted it to be permanent.
That's right. And here's where the sources point out a fascinating intellectual borrowing. Qutb adopts an idea that is strikingly similar to Leon Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution.
Trotsky, the Marxist revolutionary.
The very same. He takes that idea and applies it to the spiritual and military struggle of Islam. For Qutb, proper jihad could not be a discrete event. It couldn't be periodic or localized. It must be a permanent revolution without end. A whole way of life for pious Muslims.
Wait, let's pause there for a second. That comparison to Trotsky it's startling. I mean, Trotsky was a secular Marxist revolutionary. How did Qutb, a religious ideologue, justify importing a concept of endless global revolution from the political left?
The justification wasn't political in that secular sense. It was theological. It was rooted in his assessment of the depth of the spiritual crisis facing the Muslim world.
So if the disease is permanent, the cure must be too.
That's the logic. Qutb asserted that the challenges facing Muslims were just so vast, so pervasive, and so spiritually debilitating that they justified an endless perpetual struggle against what he called jahiliyyah.
And that term jahiliyyah, that's where Qutb's real radicalism comes in. It roughly translates to the state of ignorance of God's guidance. Classically, it refers to pre-Islamic Arabia.
Precisely. The time of spiritual darkness before the Quran. Qutb performed a radical, a revolutionary reinterpretation. He argued that the 20th century Muslim world, with its secular leaders, its Western laws, its spiritual laxity, had fallen back into a state of pagan ignorance.
So he wasn't talking about external infidels. He was applying it to modern Muslim societies.
To the societies and their ruling elites themselves.
So he's not just worried about invaders like the Soviets. He's declaring an ideological war on the entire social and political order of the Muslim world, on the very leaders who claim to be governing in the name of Islam.
That is the core revolutionary move, and it provides the theological license for internal violence. Because if the rulers are living in a state of jahiliyyah, they're apostates, and fighting them, the near enemy, is a legitimate, continuous form of worship.
This sets the stage for everything, but it also creates a huge practical problem that Qutb didn't really solve, the question of authority.
The caliphate problem.
Right. If the traditional understanding needs an established authority, a caliph, to declare this kind of struggle, what happens when that authority is gone?
And this is a profound structural complication that constrained every single jihadist ideologue that came after him. It all stems from 1924, when the Turkish National Assembly under Ataturk abolished the caliphate.
So the symbolic head of the Muslim community, the Ummah, was just gone.
Gone. And with him, the unique authority to declare an offensive jihad, a missionary jihad, aimed at expanding the abode of Islam.
So once that seat of authority was empty, declaring an offensive war became theologically very difficult, illegitimate for most mainstream scholars.
Absolutely. So if you're a jihadist ideologue after 1924 and you want to mobilize fighters and seem legitimate, you can't really use the offensive argument. That door is closed. This ideological constraint forced radical leaders to focus heavily, almost exclusively, on the one concept nobody could argue with.
Defensive jihad.
Defensive jihad.
Because defending your land when it's actively being attacked, that's universally accepted. It's an immediate obligation on every Muslim who can fight, whether a caliph declares it or not.
That is the critical legal and theological distinction. Defensive jihad requires no caliph. It's an individual obligation. And this structural reality, the need for a defensive justification, combined with Qutb's vague argument for permanent struggle, was just waiting for a crisis.
And that catalyst arrived in 1979. It provided the perfect defensive justification needed to launch the first wave.
The defining crisis. The Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. And while this was a specific crisis in a faraway land, it resonated so profoundly across the Muslim world.
Because it symbolized something much bigger.
It pointed to a broader, centuries-long general crisis, the perceived loss of Muslim lands to foreign conquest. Afghanistan became the symbol of that general humiliation.
And standing ready to seize this opportunity, to translate all that ideological ferment into mass mobilization, was Abdallah Azzam. He is the unchallenged figurehead of this first wave.
Azzam was a hugely influential Palestinian cleric and scholar. He became the key ideologue, the primary organizer for the international contingent we now call the Afghan Arabs. He didn't just watch the Soviet invasion, he moved to Peshawar, Pakistan, and he dedicated his life to giving this mobilization the robust theological and logistical legitimacy it needed.
And his major work, The Defense of Muslim Lands, went straight at that theological problem we just discussed. He leaned right into the defensive argument.
Yes. He wanted to place his call firmly within the modern Orthodox understanding. The subtitle and defining thesis of that work was crystal clear. The defense of Muslim lands is the first obligation after faith, Iman.
That's a staggering claim. The first obligation after faith itself. Most jihadist ideologues say fighting is important, but Azzam places defending territory ahead of all other actions except the declaration of faith. How did that position him relative to, say, the followers of Qutb?
This is where Azzam makes his crucial defining distinction. This is what separates the first wave from all the ones that follow. While the Qutbists were prioritizing ideological struggle against the near enemy, or the supreme status of jihad itself as a pillar, Azzam said the singular top priority was liberating occupied Muslim land from infidels, from the kuffar.
So his focus was laser sharp on territoriality.
Above all else.
So the goal wasn't a revolution in Cairo or Riyadh. It was the physical expulsion of the enemy from Kabul, a clear, actionable, and politically palatable goal.
Exactly. A goal rooted in defending sacred territory. And this focus allowed him to get support from a much broader base, including state actors who just wanted the Soviets out. The mission was specific: expel the invader. And that territorial imperative set his first wave apart dramatically from the later iterations.
Okay, but if the goal was just territorial liberation, why did Azam also push for the struggle to be permanent? If the crisis is finite, the Soviets are there, then they leave. Why shouldn't the jihad end then, like the classical tradition? It sounds like he was adopting Qutb's revolutionary idea, but giving it a deeper theological mooring.
He was, and he provided an incredibly sophisticated spiritual justification for perpetual struggle that went way beyond Qutb's vague appeal to the vastness of Jahiliyyah. Azam's explanation centered on the core Islamic concept of Tawhid.
Tawhid, the fundamental doctrine of God's oneness, his completeness, his absolute singularity.
Right.
So how does fighting a war help someone truly know God's oneness? That seems counterintuitive.
Azam argued that jihad must be permanent because it allows all Muslims, regardless of what historical moment they're born into, the unique opportunity to fully internalize and know Tawhid. He saw the intensity, the danger of fighting as a necessary existential crucible.
So, if the opportunity to fight was only episodic, entire generations might miss out on that singular, overwhelming experience of realizing God's absolute power when you're facing death. The act of war becomes a perpetual spiritual requirement for the individual.
That's the intellectual core of his argument. It transforms the struggle from a political necessity into an eternal spiritual requirement, the highest form of ibadah. In the foxhole, when everything else is stripped away, the fighter is compelled to confront the deepest existential realities.
And that leads to a profound, visceral realization of God's completeness.
And his control.
And this realization, this certainty of Tawhid, it couples perfectly with his stance on predeterminism, right? If God's already set the date of your death, you should fear nothing but God.
It's an incredibly powerful psychological tool. He stressed that you must fight freely, without hesitation, because only God should be feared, not death. There's nothing you can do to expedite or extend your life. So any fear of dying in battle is irrational. It's a sign of incomplete faith.
This ideology gives him a seemingly infinite spiritual payoff for a perpetual struggle, no matter the immediate political outcome. And that mandate gave him the authority he needed to issue his global rallying cry.
Which he did.
Which leads us directly to the most successful piece of propaganda in the history of the movement. Join the Caravan, or Ilhaq bil Kafila, published in 1987. This was the clarion call that truly launched the jihadi international concept.
The book was brilliant. Just brilliant in its simplicity and its regency. It was a direct, emotionally charged appeal for Muslims worldwide, especially young Arabs, to leave their comfortable lives and come help the Afghan mujahideen.
And he used a deeply resonant metaphor, the ancient camel caravan.
Yes.
Detail that for us. Why was that so effective?
He described the jihad against the Soviets as an old camel caravan passing quickly through the desert. If you stand there too long just thinking about joining, the opportunity will pass you by. You'll be left behind, filled with regret. This jihad was a chance of a lifetime to fulfill the highest religious obligation, and it would be forever missed if you hesitated.
And the impact was immediate. It was hugely successful, wasn't it?
It was translated into several major languages and became the single most successful piece of propaganda for recruiting foreign Muslims to Afghanistan. It was distributed through mosques, universities, these nascent international networks.
So the numbers just swelled.
They swelled so rapidly, bringing resources, skills, just pure fervor, that a second, revised edition had to be published just a year later to keep up with the demand for instruction on how to join.
What's the total scale we're talking about here, this Jihadi International that Azam created?
The total number of foreign fighters for the first wave is generally estimated at around 10,000. Could be higher. But this was a sophisticated transnational network, often highly educated guys who were trained, bonded through war, and indoctrinated with Azam's maximalist ideology.
And while Join the Caravan was all about Afghanistan, Azam never saw that as the final destination, did he? The goal was to build a persistent structure.
Absolutely. The documents show that by the late 1980s, he was already thinking globally. He was visualizing the expansion of this model. He believed the same defensive logic he used for Afghanistan could and should be applied to a dozen other occupied Muslim territories.
From the Philippines to Kashmir.
To the Balkans. He was charting a continuous roadmap for this new jihadi international.
And he was particularly focused on Palestine, his home.
He was. He saw it as the logical next base for the jihad caravan after the Soviets were expelled. He was actively calling for Muslims to join the struggle there. His vision was this sustained transnational movement focused on territorial liberation and just moving from one occupied land to the next.
But this is where the purity of that vision starts to fracture. Any movement like this, especially one made up of zealous veterans, it's going to face internal struggles over strategy. And Azam was running into a brick wall with other factions in the camps.
The internal conflict was fierce. I mean, it represented two completely different strategic doctrines. On one side, you have Azam, the universally respected intellectual figurehead. On the other, you have the Egyptian contingent, spearheaded by the militant physician Ayman al-Zawahiri.
And he brought his own history of revolutionary violence with him into the camps.
He did, and the core non-negotiable point of divergence between them revolved around targets and tactics. Despite the unbelievable brutality of the Soviet occupation, millions of Afghans killed and displaced, Azam maintained a hard line rooted in classical Sunni jurisprudence. He adamantly opposed targeting civilians, including Russian non-combatants, and he rejected terrorism as a general tool of war. For him, the focus was purely military.
Expel the occupying army. He was trying to maintain a measure of classic military ethics, even while leading a non-state movement.
That's the tragic irony. He was defending the land according to rules of engagement that were being systematically violated by the enemy, and certainly by his radical colleagues. Zawahiri and the Egyptians had a far more extreme view, rooted in Qutb's ideas. They saw the utility in civilian targeting and more revolutionary tactics. Any state collaborating with the Soviets, any ruler deemed an apostate, they were all legitimate targets.
And how did this philosophical conflict play out in the camps?
The sources suggest Zawahiri worked tirelessly to discredit Azam, particularly with Osama bin Laden, who, despite being Azam's colleague and former protege, was drifting towards Zawahiri's more aggressive worldview.
And the sources make a chilling assertion about this.
They do. They assert that had Azam not been killed, bin Laden's organization, which was still pretty nascent, might not have taken the murderous transnational path it eventually followed. Azam's intellectual prestige and moral authority stood directly in the way of targeting civilians and external powers.
That really shifts the narrative. The first wave was defined by a specific military goal and Azam's ideology. When did it officially collapse?
Well, the physical mission was achieved first. The first wave effectively ended when the Soviets pulled their last troops across the Amu Darya River in February 1989. The infidel occupier was gone.
But the ideological mission ended shortly after, and violently.
It did. Azam, the ideological driving force, was assassinated in a triple car bombing in Peshawar in November 1989, just 9 months after the Soviet withdrawal.
His death, so soon after the victory, was just devastating for his vision. It prevented him from immediately applying his model to Palestine or anywhere else.
Exactly. His death limited the chance for his specific vision to transition smoothly to the next theater. So you're left with 10,000 highly trained, highly motivated veterans, the Jihadi International, suddenly without their central battlefield, their central funding, and most critically, their unifying leader.
They were awaiting lethal force.
A force that was immediately faced with a new, highly symbolic regional crisis that demanded action.
August 1990. Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait.
On paper, this was the perfect setting for Azam's Jihadi International concept to be reborn. Another defensive territorial liberation.
And what was Osama bin Laden's immediate response?
Bin Laden, fresh from the Afghan victory, saw this as his moment, his chance to fulfill the promise of the Jihadi International. He proposed a massive defense initiative to the Saudi royal family.
What did he offer?
He offered to recruit and mobilize 100,000 mujahideen, many of them Afghan vets, to defeat the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. He was offering to recreate the model that had defeated a superpower in Afghanistan to defend the Muslim heartland.
So a local Islamic solution to a regional crisis using the force trained and hardened in the first wave.
He did. But that offer was rejected. In a decision that would just completely redirect the course of global jihad, the Saudi royal family chose instead to rely on the military forces of the United States.
They prioritized the rapid, overwhelming power of the American military over the unpredictable zeal of the Jihadi International.
They did. And that rejection was the strategic decision that definitively marked the end of the first wave and forced the radical ideological pivot that defined the second.
Let's dive into that fallout inside Saudi Arabia, because this decision created the internal justification for everything that came next.
The reaction inside Saudi Arabia was explosive. The early 1990s in the kingdom became known as the Sawa, the Awakening. It was a time of intense Islamist demands and opposition. The decision to bring U.S. military forces, the Judeo-Crusader Alliance, as it was immediately dubbed into the Arabian Peninsula, into the heartland of Islam, was seen as a profound betrayal.
It was religious and political crisis rolled into one. The state chose infidel protection over Muslim defenders.
And the dissent was palpable. Bin Laden quickly joined other influential Saudi Islamists in denouncing Riyadh's decision. The ruling family responded with predictable suppression, imprisoning many prominent clerics and academics.
Can you give us some specifics on who was imprisoned? I think that really shows how domestic dissent fueled the international pivot.
Certainly. Key figures were Sheikhs Safar al-Hawali and Salman al-Auda. These were influential figures who, critically, weren't immediately calling for violent overthrow, but were passionately criticizing the government's foreign policy, its corruption, its reliance on foreign powers.
And their imprisonment just intensified the opposition.
It did. The regime was signaling that any critique of their strategic decisions would be treated as sedition. And this political environment solidified into active organizations.
Organizations that provided a voice for this dissent.
A voice both domestically and increasingly internationally. Bin Laden was closely associated with two of them: the Committee for Advice and Reform and the Committee for the Defense of Legitimate Rights. When key members of these groups were expelled from Saudi Arabia and found refuge in London, they became highly effective external opposition voices.
How did they manage to get their message out? Back into the kingdom.
They leveraged the new technology of the era. The Committee for the Defense of Legitimate Rights, for instance, became notorious for using fax machines. They would transmit these long, detailed, highly critical communiques directly to fax numbers across Saudi Arabia, bypassing state media.
So the Saudi decision politicized the first wave veterans and provided this narrative of betrayal that fueled domestic unrest. How did bin Laden then translate that domestic crisis into a new international strategic direction?
This is the critical strategic leap. When bin Laden issued his famous calls to arms against the Judeo-Crusader Alliance, particularly after 1996, the underlying motivation wasn't primarily to defeat the U.S. in general. It was primarily directed at the continued U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia.
The U.S. forces protecting the House of Saud.
Exactly. And this leads us to the source's most powerful analysis. The idea that bin Laden's subsequent transnational jihad became a fig leaf.
A fig leaf. A cover for something else.
Yes. The sources argued that this global fight was primarily a cover, masking his true driving desire to seize power and establish a truly Islamic state in his native land. His immediate problem was the Saudi royal family, the near enemy. But directly fighting the powerful Saudi regime was difficult. It lacked wide legitimacy.
So instead of directly attacking the powerful near enemy, he pivots to attacking the far enemy, the United States, because they were the regime's protectors and the symbol of its corruption.
Precisely. The logic was, if you cut off the support system, the regime collapses.
Yeah.
And by attacking the U.S., the global far enemy, he gained the legitimacy and the mobilization fuel that he couldn't get by just fighting the House of Saud. I mean, the bulk of al-Qaeda's initial foot soldiers were Saudi and Yemeni. It reflects the nationalist context of his personal struggle.
So he appropriated the language of global religious liberation to achieve a nationalist political goal.
Absolutely. By invoking the language of Islamic defense, by summoning Muslims to liberate Islam's holiest places, bin Laden attained global legitimacy for what was, at its core, a nationalist agenda. It allowed him to move past the territorial focus of Islam and fully embrace the Quwat-based revolutionary mission, only he executed it on a global scale.
What a complete, almost perfect reversal of the first wave's principles. The first wave, under Azam, was purely defensive and territorial. The rejection of that defensive model in Kuwait forced a shift where the domestic problem, the Saudi regime, was masked by fighting the international problem, the United States.
It was the ultimate necessary betrayal of the first wave's ethos. The Saudis' rejection of the Jihadi international offer in 1990 marked the definitive end of Azam's territorial defensive first wave, and it simultaneously set the stage, ideologically and logistically, for the second wave.
A wave that would be defined by the figure of Osama bin Laden and the bloody consequences of his pivot to the far enemy strategy. The tragedy of the first wave is that it succeeded militarily.
It did. It expelled a superpower.
But the powerful ideological and human infrastructure it created quickly became orphaned. This highly trained international force was robbed of its leader and then immediately rejected by the very rulers it sought to defend. It was a force seeking a new, catastrophic purpose.
An international force that had been taught that permanent struggle was the highest form of worship. The question after 1990 was not if they would fight again, but who they would fight and how they would justify it.
We conclude this deep dive here. Join us next time as we explore the second wave of global jihad, defined by the figure of Osama bin Laden and the bloody consequences of his pivot to the far enemy.